Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. With Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom finally releasing in theaters last week, the DCEU has officially come to an end. It is over, it is done with the Snyderverse, is officially dead, and for some you'll be absolutely devastated by this news, by the end of this universe that you absolutely love, and for some you'll be cheering it on because you're excited for what James Gunn is going to be doing with the future of DC. And I'm a little bit in the middle because I did enjoy my time in this universe, and it is very sad to say goodbye, but you can't deny that there's been a lot of ups and a lot of downs in this series. So we're going to be ranking every single film in the DCEU from number 16 to number 1, and maybe I'll throw Peacemaker in there at the end to see where that lines up. But I cannot wait to talk about all these films because, again, it's been a roller coaster. And I did rewatch all of these films before The Flash came out earlier in this summer, and when I was rewatching all these films, I went in with the mindset of, you know what, this is going to be the last time that I ever watch all of these movies. And as I was going through, I was like, you know what, maybe I will revisit this one day. And so that's how I'm going to kind of be guiding you through this ranking list. I'm not going to give a star rating or a number rating for these. I'm just going to give you a, will I ever rewatch it again? Yes, no, definitely, definitely not. And we're just going to go from there. So let's see what number 16 is. Of course there's going to be Suicide Squad. I imagine that this film is at the bottom of most people's rankings of the DCEU, and I know this movie has its fans, and of course people are clamoring for the David Ayer cut of this movie, and of course, with this being the last time that I rewatch all of these movies, I decided that since I absolutely despise this movie, I have a review out for it on the channel, I was going to go all out. I was going to watch the extended cut of this movie that I had never seen before, and you know what? I will say that it did add some things to this movie that I did appreciate. For one, I do think it actually feels a little bit more like a real movie, especially in the second act. The first act is still just a music video gone wrong. It is terribly thrown together. It is so mixed up in the editing, and you can tell that the studio really did butcher this movie. But once it gets into the second act and you get to see the characters actually go on their mission, I think that this extended cut gives a lot of stuff for Harley Quinn in particular to do, to kind of be that force to bring all these people together, even though that was never her intent to begin with. But still, the last act and the first act of this movie are just so rough to get through, and even though the second act was improved in this version of the film, I still do not enjoy this film. It really has one of the worst endings to a comic book film that I've seen in a while, besides Fantastic. That one still has a beat, but this one, it's rough. It's really bad. But you know what? I think what this movie did great was, some of the casting choices. I think getting Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn is something that you can easily thank this movie for, along with Joel Kinnaman as Rick Flag. I think that this movie and their dynamic is actually pretty important. Not necessarily important, but it's nice to see this movie in order to go into the Suicide Squad and see how their dynamic kind of shifts into that film as well. And so this movie is not without its good moments, but I think in general, for the most part, I just do not enjoy this movie, and I will definitely never rewatch this movie again. I've seen it a lot of times, too. I've always gone back to it for whatever reason, but this will be the final time that I ever watch this movie, so good riddance to Suicide Squad. This movie truly was the death of the Snyderverse as we know it. And yes, there were some attempts to try to revive it, with Black Adam trying to bring back these cast members a little bit later on in the franchise, but really, this was the lid closing on the coffin. It wasn't the final nail, but it really was a signaling of, the executives at Warner Brothers going in a different direction and really shooting themselves in the foot with this one, because this movie is an absolute disaster. And I've always thought that the DCEU, with how things formed with the first, set of movies, was always a reaction to something. I think Man of Steel was a reaction to The Dark Knight, taking the superhero of Batman or Superman, taking a more serious, more dark, and more realistic turn for the character. It is a reaction to The Dark Knight. And then you have Batman versus Superman, which I think was a reaction to both Man of Steel and also Marvel at this point in time, because of course you're going to need to have your crossover events, and they kind of rush bringing all these characters together. And I still argue to this day that I think it could have worked. I think you could have had, Man of Steel, then Batman vs. Superman, and then Justice League all together. And if they did work together, and if it did build these characters, and if it teased these characters enough, and then you had their solo films, I think that idea could possibly work. But it needs to be executed correctly, and I do think that the foundation that was set in Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman wasn't strong enough to make this work, which is why I think that Warner Brothers got so scared at this point and abandoned this idea, because, Batman vs. Superman was a very dark and long movie that was chopped up in this movie. Okay, we're going to get rid of the darkness because people clearly didn't like that, at least the critical reviews and some of the reception from the audience didn't like Batman vs. Superman, so let's hire on Joss Whedon to try to make this like Marvel. And like I said, foundation is extremely important. think Joss Whedon did great with the Avengers because of the foundation set with all the other filmmakers, with setting up all these individual characters, but bringing him in to fix a movie, to try to, salvage the pieces and try to make it into something else was a terrible idea, because all he's going to do is add the Whedonisms that he puts in his movies that are not going to work so much. The comedy in this movie really falls flat, and it's funny to see the extended cut or the actual version of this movie with the Zack Snyder cuts have all the good moments coming from him and none of the good moments coming from Joss Whedon, and so it really is just a tired excuse. You can even tell the cast is exhausted in this movie. They do not care. The mustache debacle, this movie was a disaster from beginning to end, and honestly, if I watch the extended cut of Suicide Squad, it's probably number 15 technically, but I think if you just count the theatrical in general, I would still put this at number 15 instead of at the very bottom. But I do think of all these films, this one's probably the easiest, along with Suicide Squad, to never want to watch again. So again, good riddance to Justice League. At number 14 is going to be Black Adam, and honestly, this movie's not offensively bad. This movie is just okay. I do have a lot of problems with this movie, but in terms of the DCU movies thus far that I've talked about, this one has some genuinely good things about it, and in particular, the JSA in this film is really good. I think if, I know that James Gunn is kind of keeping some casting things maybe, and maybe not keeping others. It's really confusing, especially with his, the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker and Amanda Waller show and stuff like that. I don't really know how that's going to go, but if he does keep anybody, I wouldn't mind seeing Hawkman in particular return in the DCEU, and especially Dr. Fate, Pierce Brosnan as Dr. Fate. Even though his fate in this movie was pretty, definitively at an end, I did enjoy these characters quite a bit in this film, and even to The Rock's credit, I do think that he's not playing the character that he usually plays in movies. He had kind of a harder edge to him. He was a little bit more of a heel in this movie in some sort of ways. He was still, an anti-hero. He was the hero of the movie by the end of it, but still, he had a darker edge, which I did appreciate. What it really comes down to is the editing for me, because even though the action sequences in this film are entertaining enough, they felt so just like an assembly line of cuts. It felt like every couple of seconds it was a cut, and there was a cut, it was a cut. It was the exact same pace throughout the entire movie, and there was no differentiation into when you decided to do a cut or different ways to do a cut. It just felt like it was just, on autopilot with how this movie was edited, and it made some of these action sequences exhausting, and not in a way that Man of Steel kind of got exhausting with it being extended, but in terms of it feeling repetitive and just felt kind of boring after a certain amount of time. And this movie has been in development since literally the early 2000s, with The Rock, being cast as Black Adam, like so long ago. So it felt like The Rock, was watching all these superhero movies in the early 2000s, like, I want to do that. And then it literally took them 15 years to get this project made, but they never went back to the script since the early 2000s, because this movie hits every single trope of a superhero movie you can possibly think of, even up until a Skybeam. And this movie is somewhat recent. This movie was not made in 2015 or 2012 or something like that. This movie came out like just a couple years ago, and it still did the Skybeam thing. And so it felt a little bit outdated in that sort of way. The editing was choppy, even though the casting I do think was solid in this movie. But I think the worst thing about this movie was The Rock's approach to trying to take over the DCEU. And you can tell that, he really wanted to do a Black Adam versus Superman movie, which, it's fine. You're a character that is the villain of a Shazam movie. I do wish we got him in Shazam 2 instead of, what he was planning on doing with him taking over the DCEU at this point in time. And he was desperately trying to get Henry Cavill back, and they got Henry Cavill back. But at the same time, at this point in time, James Gunn was already like in a year into writing Superman Legacy. So why would the studio do this? I think that is another extremely dumb decision that the studio made, was to try to tease something that was never going to happen. And so by the end of it, Black Adam is one of those films I have absolutely no interest in revisiting. I watched it once in theaters. I watched it once for my rewatch before The Flash came out. And you know what? I'm good. I don't need to watch this again. It's not like a hell no, I'm never going to watch this again, but I'm not going to seek this one out. I don't see a reason why to seek it out. Speaking of movies I'm never going to watch again, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is the ending of the DCEU, and what's a sad way to end this franchise. Honestly, I was really heartbroken watching this movie, not because this movie is, again, offensively bad, like I said, it's about on par with the Black Adam level of this, of this franchise, but honestly, I unapologetically love the first Aquaman movie, and that movie is unhinged as hell. The last 30 minutes of Aquaman is insane, and I love it for it. This movie felt a lot more tame in comparison, and you can also definitely tell that this movie was definitely messed with in post-production. Things either taken out or shifted around, whether it's the Amber Heard stuff or whether it's the Batman stuff that was taken out of this movie. You can tell that this movie was one thing and it is now a different thing when it was released in theaters, and that's a shame. But even still, the movie did feel tame in a way because it didn't really have that bombastic sort of style that the first movie had, where it was, absolutely insane and unhinged for a full 2.5 hours. This movie is only 2 hours long, and even the finale, the last 30 minutes of it, didn't get nearly as crazy as the armies that were, running into each other, riding sharks and lasers flying everywhere, and a giant kraken-like creature bursting through the ground at the ending of that film, and the great, trident fights in Aquaman. Yes, I'll get into Aquaman. I'm kind of gushing about that movie because I do love that movie, but this one had absolutely none of that. What it did have, though, was a continuation of the dynamic between Patrick Wilson and Jason Momoa in this movie, which honestly, I did love a lot of that, even though if that wasn't the intention of going into this movie, maybe it was supposed to be an Amber Heard type thing of them going on an adventure, and then obviously all that stuff happened, so they kind of had to do a course correct and do something else. I don't know if this was always the plan, but either way, I do think it was the right decision. But it is still weird for this movie to be as, based on family as it is, with Black Manta coming back to try to kill all the family members of, Aquaman's character, and his family's barely in it. Yes, he has a son with Mara, but you never really get to see the son. You never really get to see Mara because it was all cut out. And so it's just this brother dynamic throughout the entire film, but the family, theme of this film doesn't really hit home because you feel like you're cutting around certain things. So I think the emotion and the heart of this movie fell flat. Even the Black Manta thing with him coming back to, fight Aquaman in this movie, he was just kind of a puppet to another villain, another big bad, like he was in the first one. So even that felt disappointing. Even just in general, this movie felt very, very underwhelming compared to the first film. As somebody who did love that first film, this one was just a disappointment that I'm only going to watch it once in theaters. You know what? I'm good. The DCEU is dead. I'm good not revisiting this one either. Okay. Before all the Snyderverse fans jump on me and hate me for having Batman vs Superman this low on the list, it's your guys' fault. Honestly, I do think that this Snyder cultist and the really toxic fandom really did make me look at this movie in a lot more of a critical manner. I blame you guys. This is your guys' fault. But honestly, this movie I did like for a while, and I do still like it. Honestly, I think at this point in the movie, I do like and enjoy these movies from this point onward in the DCU. Everything else before this I don't really like too much, but this one I do like in general. I think the extended cut and Lex Luthor's plan and how it actually fleshes out as a real movie in that extended cut is really solid. I do enjoy that quite a bit, but I think that the flaws in this movie at its core are just that much more of a problem for me. First, let's talk about the good. Honestly, the opening scene of this movie and really all the action sequences throughout this entire movie are all phenomenal. Some of the best action sequences in the DCEU at large. I love the opening scene. I love the Batman warehouse scene. I love the actual Batman versus Superman fights in this movie. And I absolutely do love the Doomsday fight at the end, which I think a lot of people don't like that too much. I do enjoy it. I think this movie has a darkness and intensity that does work for the story that they're trying to tell. And I do think that Zack Snyder does a good job handling this version of this world if you're going down this route. So, I know some people just don't like this darker route in general for the DCU, but I don't mind it because I think that Snyder has a handle on that sort of tone for the most part, and it does work. I do think this movie felt a little bit too dreary and a little bit too bleak for my taste, but still, I do think that Zack Snyder does a good job with that sort of tone. But my flaws are really at the core of who these characters are, unfortunately, and let's get into the not so good, because I do think that this movie learned all the wrong lessons from Man of Steel, which I'll get into Man of Steel here in a second, but I do think that movie sets up a Superman that doesn't have that much of a hopeful, he's not really heroic in that film. And so, this movie was a reaction again to Man of Steel and to, Avengers, throwing all these ideas together, which could have worked on paper. But because Superman, as a fan, I don't see that character as heroic, because you never see Superman ever in this series actually save someone. The only people he saves is Martha and Lois Lane. Those are the only people he saves. There's a little montage in this movie for 2 minutes of him, saving a rocket ship and, bringing some people down from a fire and showing up at a flooding situation. But you never get to connect with these situations because it just montages through it. And so you never get to see Superman in any situation, whether it's, a big fight at the end of Man of Steel or the big fight at the end of this movie, actually save somebody's life and be a hero in the eye of the public. And so as a fan watching this movie and seeing that the world is prosecuting Superman for causing all these atrocities, I agree with that. And I think that is the problem with this movie, is I shouldn't be agreeing with the forms of antagonism in this film. I should be like, no, Superman's a good guy. He is a hero. He is misunderstood by these people because he's being framed by Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor didn't need to go through this convoluted plan to frame Superman. He was already, seen in that light to begin with because of how the audience reacted to Man of Steel. And I think that's just my main problem with the foundation of the DCEU, which I think is the reason why Warner Brothers freaked out and started changing all these things, even though, yes, he had a direction that he wanted to go, and we saw with the Snyder Cut what that direction was and how it could have been lighter. By that point, I think that Snyder could have gone in that direction and lightened his tone and evolved over time, but obviously he was not given the chance to do that. But I do think that, giving Superman the type of role that he had in these earlier movies laid such a rocky foundation where I don't blame Warner Brothers for being as reactionary as they were, because it clearly wasn't working for half of the audience that were watching these films, including myself. And then we have Batman in this film, which again, I love the action sequences throughout this film, and Ben Affleck I do think is a good Batman for the most part in this film. I think the killing thing is very annoying because of how blatant it is. And yes, I know I did a video, a couple years ago reviewing like every Batman movie ever. I think I watched 27 Batman movies, animated and live action. And the only live action ones where Batman doesn't kill somebody is the 1966 Adam West Batman movie. Actually, no, he does kill people in that.
Antimatter? You mean they won't be coming back?
No, Robin. Not in this universe.
No, I think it's Batman and Robin is the one where he doesn't kill anybody, and the Batman he doesn't directly kill, or maybe he does kill somebody in the Batman. Honestly, maybe it's just Batman and Robin. I think that's the only live-action Batman movie where Batman does not kill somebody, but this one is so blatantly direct and violent that it's just like, it's almost offensive to the character itself that it is very noticeable and very glaring as a flaw in this movie. But again, I do like Ben Affleck as a casting choice. He was an unconventional idea to cast as Batman, but I think it worked in this. And so like I said, I do just barely like this movie. This is definitely at the bottom of my likes in the DCEU, because every single time that I see something that I love in this movie, it's immediately followed by something extremely dumb. And so it's such a back and forth with me in my head every single time that I watch this movie that it is a frustrating watch at this point, especially because, again, of that toxic fandom that has surrounded this movie that has just kind of made me a little bit like just giving up hope on watching these movies and enjoying these movies because of that toxicity around these films, which is, it's really sad to me because I do enjoy this film for the most part, but the conversation around it is something that I don't enjoy. And sadly, I don't think I'm going to be rewatching this movie anytime soon. It's not like a definitely no. Maybe if I get in the mood to watch like the Snyderverse trilogy, maybe I'll watch it again one day, but I'm not rushing out to watch that anytime soon. I have a wild theory about this movie. Okay, hear me out. I think this movie was meant to take place in modern day, but because of DC restructuring and trying to get away from the Snyderverse, they changed it. I don't know why, but I think that's true. But let's get into Wonder Woman 84. This movie is, not as bad as I remembered it. I remembered not really caring for it, when I first watched it when it was released in 2020. And I wasn't really looking forward on my rewatch to watching this movie. But again, that sourness that I feel for BVS didn't follow through with this one, because I think this one has a lot of fun moments that are entertaining. The most wild thing in this movie is the fact that it made Wonder Woman's invisible jet actually good. That's the cheesiest thing ever, but that was one of the sweetest moments in this entire movie, was Wonder Woman's invisible jet. Patty Jenkins, how in the world did he make that idea work in a movie? But really, I think the cast is having a lot of fun here. I do like Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman in both of the Wonder Woman films, and she is still solid in this movie as well. And bring Chris Pine back, even though they did it in a weird way with an alternate body that is a questionable choice, let's just say that. I do like having Chris Pine back here because it gives her a good reason to wrap up her arc in this film. And the reason why I say that I think this movie was meant to take place, or at least it'd make more sense if it took place in modern day, is, if you look at Wonder Woman's arc in, all three of these films, the first one, or in Wonder Woman, she loses, Steve Trevor. She loses the love of her life. In Batman vs. Superman, she's, hidden away for all those years, and she comes back into the fold at that point in time. Then you have Justice League happen. Let's even talk about the Snyder cut of that movie. She is still kind of sad about Steve Trevor being gone. She still mentions it, seeing how that really did define, what her character is at large. And then this movie, with having the theme of be careful what you wish for, you have Wonder Woman Gal Gadot's, still not being over the love of her life, wishing for him to come back, and he does come back, and she finally has to reconcile with the idea that she needs to say goodbye to Steve Trevor at this point in time, and she does. She renounces her wish, and it is a very sad and tragic moment, and it is very much a moment that actually pulls at the heartstring, unlike every other DC film that I talked about thus far. As this one does have a significant amount of heart with it, with this dynamic, this relationship. But if you put it in the other order, and you now have this in the 80s before Justice League takes place, then it doesn't make sense of why she's still hung up over these ideas in Batman vs. Superman and in Justice League of her being sad about Steve Trevor, because her arc is over in this film. And it's just a thing that bothers me. I don't know why. It really bothers me. It just seems like they went back in an arc that should have been resolved in the timeline. It's messy. The first half of this movie I do enjoy up until a certain point, but then I realize, like, oh, it's been an hour and we're still kind of, working up to what this movie is actually about. I do like Kristen Wiig in the first two acts of this movie as Cheetah. I do think that she, has a good role, especially when you come to the White House sequence. I think that should have been the final form for a character instead of going full Cats in the last 20 minutes, which that is really rough. But I also do like Pedro Pascal as Maxwell Lord in this movie. I think that he is giving such an unhinged and fun performance in this that does fit the tone of this movie. That is entertaining. But again, the timeline thing, having all these, missiles in the air, these nukes in the air, and all these people, getting their wishes and killing each other and being all crazy in the streets, you feel like if, people experience this thing in the 80s, they would remember that and remember who Wonder Woman is by, the Justice League and all that, and Batman vs. Superman. It's just like, the timeline of this movie being set in 84 is my biggest problem with it, honestly. It makes absolutely no sense. But the rest of the movie is just kind of not really memorable to me. Like I said, the Steve Trevor and Wonder Woman, relationship and that heart in this film is really the only reason why I have this above Batman vs. Superman. But the rest of the movie is just, it's fine. It's watchable. It's entertaining. There's nothing offensively bad. It doesn't take these characters in a direction that I think is, an offensive way to adapt these characters, like in Batman vs. Superman. And so really, maybe Batman vs. Superman has some higher highs, but that movie also has lower lows than this one. This one's just kind of like meandering in the middle. And so maybe in some world, maybe I'll switch the order of those two movies. But as of right now, I do enjoy Wonder Woman 84 just a little bit more than Batman vs. Superman. But again, it's not too memorable, and I don't think I'm going to be rewatching this movie. I thought maybe I will if they did continue with Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman in a Wonder Woman 3, and I wouldn't mind rewatching the trilogy as a whole, but I don't think that's going to happen anymore. And so probably not going to go back and revisit this movie anytime soon, but I guess if they make a Wonder Woman 3, then maybe. Honestly, think I like this movie more than most people. I do enjoy the Shazam movies quite a bit, and I think part of that is my love for David F. Sandberg as a filmmaker and my love for this cast, because I do think that this sequel to Shazam does flow through these characters and the character, the dynamics and the chemistry between all the actors in this film pretty well. And I do think the biggest mistake this movie makes is having too much Zachary Levi and not enough Asher Angel to kind of be the heart of the movie like it was in the first film. But for the most part, I do think that this movie is extremely fun and entertaining. If you can entertain me in a film and not make me think about all the outside world implications that the DCEU has, all the baggage that this series has in general, then that's a plus side for me. And this movie has one thing that Batman vs. Superman absolutely does not have, and that is our heroes actually being heroic and actually going out and saving people. I love the bridge sequence at the beginning of this movie. It even has a cameo from David F. Sandberg's wife that I do really enjoy seeing her on screen. In the cars, it's falling off the bridge and Shazam saves her, and then that entire sequence happens and then the bridge collapses and it ends in a little joke. But it shows that these characters have a lot of heart to them. They are very well intentioned as heroes, and I think the arc that's Billy goes through in this film is pretty solid as well. Again, I would like to see Asher Angel in this movie more than Zachary Levi, because I think that dynamic doesn't work as well, especially with Asher Angel getting a little bit too old for the role. But I do like the arc that he does go through in this film. I also like the dragon a lot. Dragons are fun in movies. We need more dragons in movies. I need House of the Dragon to return. I think that's really what I need. But this movie gave me a good dose of dragons to kind of hold me over up until that point. So the action sequences are fun, the cast was fun, the chemistry between the leads was always great, and as a Shazam sequel, I think it was a good follow-up, not a great follow-up to that first one, but an entertaining enough one for me as a fan of the Shazam series. But that being said, I honestly don't know if I will revisit this one all that often. Maybe if I'm watching the first one again, I'll want to turn on the second one. Maybe that'll kind of like lead me into watching it again, but maybe I'll revisit it one day, maybe not. Honestly, I wouldn't really care either way. Okay, in real time, I decided to switch the order. This is actually my number 9. I know I say number 9 when I talk about the next movie on the list, but I'm actually moving this one below the next one. Let's talk about The Flash. This is a movie that I was extremely excited for because The Flash is one of my favorite comic heroes of all time. I think that some of my bias for how much I love The Flash as a character kind of affected my response to this movie at first, because I do enjoy this movie. I know baffling people are gonna like gasp and say, how dare you like this movie, but I do think that on paper the script here for the most part is pretty good. As an adaptation of the Flashpoint storyline, I think it does a very interesting adaptation and a way that it can build off of this universe, the DCEU itself, to adapt that storyline. In the comic Flashpoint storyline and in the animated film, of course, you had Superman land Russia instead of the United States and kind of taking that Supergirl role. You have, Batman being, Thomas Wayne instead of Bruce Wayne in that universe and kind of having that hardened edge, and you get to see Martha be Joker in that movie. And then you get to see, the Aquaman Atlantean world and the Themyscira world of Wonder Woman being at war with each other and kind of shaping this disaster that has all been caused by the Flash going back in time and changing the timeline. In that film, it was kind of like a reveal at the end that it was the Flash. In this one, from the beginning that this is the Flash trying to save his mother. And so I've always loved the Flashpoint storyline because the Flash at its core is a time traveler. If you take time travel out of the Flash, who is he really? He's just going to be the butt of a joke like he was in Justice League. But no, this is the point of this character, is to mess with the timeline, to make mistakes, to try to go back and save his mom and cause all these problems in the timeline. And I think to adapt that sort of storyline in the DCEU, I think they did a good job, because at this point in time, the DCEU is a mess. It is scattered. You don't really have the casting choices anymore with Henry Cavill and Ben Affleck, and so it was going to be fishy no matter what. It was going to be an issue to bring some people back in general, and so they're going to try to go in their own direction for it. So what was their, problem-solving way? Yes, you did have Ben Affleck at the beginning of this movie, and I think that he looked a little goofy, but maybe it's a tonal thing of how goofy he looked at the beginning of this movie. But you go back in time and you change the timeline and you do a different universe. You add some multiverse stuff to it instead, and so you bring back Michael Keaton as Batman, which I love Michael Keaton's Batman movies, and I think that he was great in this movie. And you do Supergirl instead of Superman because you can't get back Henry Cavill. That is fine, because Sasha Calle was great in this movie. I absolutely loved her. She stole the entire movie for me. And then you have this Flash storyline with his mother that I do think is very engaging and very heartbreaking. To see him, having to decide to let his mother die, that is one of the most important arcs for, this character to have. And I do think that it, in a way was an origin story at the same time as being, a movie that's already established with this character not having to deal with the baggage of being an origin story. And so I think in that way, it used the Flashpoint storyline to be an origin story in that unconventional way. And so I think this movie on paper has a lot of great ideas, and that scene with Barry and his mom at the end of the movie really does bring me to tears. But then you have the issues with this movie, the terrible CGI. You can say it was a creative choice or not, I don't know. It probably was a budgetary thing, but it did not work. And then you have the thing that made me the most conflicted about this film, and that was Ezra Miller. And this is even outside of the whole controversies, set that aside. Let's just talk about their performance in this movie in general, because I don't really like this performance because of my perception of who the Flash is because of the TV show. I love Grant Gustin as that character, as Barry Allen. I think that Ezra Miller is a little bit too manic, a little bit too weird, and a little bit too, I guess, awkward and twitchy. And I know as the film goes on and the original Barry becomes more of a mentor to the younger Barry, that kind of, balances out in that character, and that is the arc that Barry goes through in this film. But I think that Ezra Miller went just a little bit too far with that manic energy in this film. That just didn't feel like Barry Allen. They were just so awkward as this character that it just bothered me quite a bit, which was unfortunate. And it did kind of get better when I rewatched it, just a little bit, but really the main performance in this film was a bit of a letdown. And the way that the CGI ended up in the third act of this movie being, very hectic and very entertaining in terms of a Flashpoint sort of way with a lot of heart, but the CGI really did bring that down. It's a frustrating movie for me as a fan of The Flash, because I think it conceptually pushes off the idea of what a Flash movie can be on a cinematic scale. And I love that. I love seeing The Flash on the big screen with the the high budget and the visual effects that you can get with that, because it's still, for the most part, at least some of it is better than the TV show, but it did miss what the TV show did really well, which was character, those arcs, and just an overall just painting a picture of who Barry Allen is as a character. And I think this movie does kind of falter on that a little bit because of the performance from Ezra Miller. But again, I'm very conflicted about this movie. I want to love it at the same time with my bias of loving the Flash character so very much, but it just doesn't really do it for me to that extent. And honestly, I don't know if I would rewatch this film. I'll put it firmly in the maybe category because, again, I think my love for the Flash character and Michael Keaton and Sasha Calle in this movie as Supergirl would make me want to return to this world to watch it one more time because of how fun of an adventure movie it is. But at the same time, my other flaws and Ezra Miller, just, I don't know. Maybe I'll revisit one day. All right, at number 9 is the one that started it all. And yes, I already did talk about it a decent amount when I talked about Batman vs. Superman, but let's get a little bit deeper into this movie. And like I said, I do think that the biggest problem with this film is the fact that Superman doesn't save anybody. And it becomes even more glaringly obvious when other side characters in this film go out of their way to be a hero when our main character does not do that. The only time that Superman saves anybody is, again, Lois Lane like 2 or 3 times in this movie, and Martha once in this movie, and so he doesn't go out of his way to save anybody. Even Perry White goes out of his way to try to save a coworker, risking his life when the city is being destroyed to go over to try to get this person out of rubble. That's something that you never see from Superman in this movie. Even Lois Lane has some heroic moments in this movie. Even that random like military guy at the end of the movie when he's in the plane has that moment where he goes and he flies a plane into the ship to destroy it at the end of the movie, being a hero, sacrificing his own life to save the day in knocking out that other, Kryptonian person in this movie that he kind of had a feud with. I was more invested in that moments than I was in some of the moments that, Superman had with some of these other Kryptonians. But what does really work in this movie is Zod. Honestly, Michael Shannon is extremely over the top as Zod in this movie, but it works. He has this intensity and this performance that really just draws you in as an audience member, and he is so engaging in this film. And honestly, if it was a different actor, if it wasn't Michael Shannon playing this role with the intensity that he has, I don't think I would enjoy this movie, because if you have a great villain to face off against your hero, it makes your hero look better than maybe he was on paper in this script. And he was a very, very intense villain. And I love the almost Signs like alien invasion tone that this movie has that Zack Snyder brought to it. I do think that is a very smart choice when you're trying to ground Superman to reality in that sort of way. And I do like, again, Henry Cavill as his character. I do think that he was a good casting choice. I do think he goes through some growing pains as an actor in this movie. There's some lines that are a little bit stilted, especially that general line at the very end of the movie that was really bad, but for the most part, I do like him a lot in this movie. And honestly, I think Henry Cavill really got the short end of the stick in this series because, he was given this movie. He was the one who started it all, and then he died in the next movie, and then he was barely in Justice League because, again, he was dead at that point. And so, in terms of screen time, he has fairly low screen time, even though he is extremely important in this series. And, the hope and the symbol of hope that he had, or he was, supposed to have in this series, was so praised upon in all these other movies that it felt just that much more painful to see him not return in his roles, whether it was in Shazam with his head being cut off, or in some of the other films, or him coming back in Black Adam and then a month later ripping it away from Henry Cavill once again. They did him so dirty in this series throughout the 10-year run of the DCEU that just, again, it is very sad to see this go, to see Henry Cavill not get a chance to play this character again. But he's off doing better things. He's he played The Witcher for a while, and I'm curious to see where his career goes from this point on, because I do think that he is an actor. I think he's been growing as an actor, especially in this time, and so I wish him the best. But I do think that his time as Superman was unfortunately cut short because of some baffling studio decisions. But this movie, again, in general, I do think that it's lacking the heroism from Superman, but it does have some great action, some great tone with the alien invasion stuff. I think Zack Snyder does a good job with that sort of thing. But I was just, clamoring for a little bit more in this film than what it set up to begin with. But you know what? One thing is for sure, I do think I will revisit Man of Steel again one day. Like I said, if I feel in the mood to watch Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, and the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League one day, I'll probably go back to revisit these movies one day. So I will say probably to revisiting Man of Steel, just probably not for a little while. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Aquaman. I absolutely love, unapologetically so love Aquaman. I own this movie on 4K. I'm such a fan of this film, and I know it has its problems. It is extremely dumb. This movie is ridiculous. It makes hardly any sense, and it's really a mishmash of a bunch of different films. It's basically a mix between Black Panther, How to Train Your Dragon 2, Avatar, and maybe a few others. It is such a mishmash of all these different ideas that is just kind of thrown together in this ridiculously over the top and insane movie. But that is why I absolutely love it. I think it's so crazy that they gave James Wan the ability to just go nuts on his very first attempt at making an Aquaman movie that feels like 3 movies mashed into one and is, again, completely unhinged. Patrick Wilson is definitely the standout in this film. He is so over the top and having so much fun in this role, just screaming at the top of his lungs. I do think that it sets up that, rivalry between, brothers in this movie, between him and Jason Momoa, that does work really well. I do like him a lot as a villain. That final fight with the tridents at the end of the film is absolutely just stylistically beautiful to look at, even though it does look a little bit cartoony, but it looks stylistically cartoony. It looks like it's on purpose, unlike The Flash, with the style that movie had. And so this movie it visually looks great. It is completely bonkers. The script is insane. I do like the setup of Black Manta. There's a whole middle section of the movie going to Africa with Mera that I think has some fun fish out of water moments in that point of the movie, but I do think that the chemistry between Amber Heard and Jason Momoa is absolutely non-existent. I don't think they worked really well together on screen at all in this film, but really everything else about this movie, again, it's dumb as hell, but I unapologetically love it. This one I will definitely be rewatching. I find myself actually rewatching this movie a lot more often than I should because I just have fun watching it. I will turn it on and just laugh my ass off. So I unapologetically love this movie. Okay, let's continue my love for David F. Sandberg. Shazam, I think, is a really great movie that, again, what was missing from the foundation of the DCEU was the heart, was the emotion, and was the connection to the characters at a more deep level besides, oh, that's Batman and that's Superman, that's Wonder Woman. This movie has such a great emotional core to it and a family dynamic that is so integral to the character of Shazam that I think that they absolutely nailed it on first go. I think that David F. Sandberg was a great choice to direct this movie because, again, he can do some of those fun horror-like elements for a kid-style horror movie in this film while also having a lot of great heart and character moments and having a very fun cast. I think that Zachary Levi is good as Shazam in this movie more than he was in the sequel. I think that he's a little bit too over the top in the sequel, whereas in this one I do think that he does have a nice balance, and I think that him and Asher Angel do kind of fit together as one character in this film quite well, along with all the other kids in this movie just really kind of building out the rest of the Shazamily. That's just, again, it worked really well for me. And again, that heart. It's all about the heart for these films. The reason why I like them more than most other people is if it didn't have that heart, I wouldn't like it, but because it does have all that heart, it is so fun to watch. This movie does definitely have a villain problem. Again, I like the stylistic thing of kind of being like a kid's horror movie with these monsters in this film that I think that gives David F. Sandberg some fun to play in the director's seat, but in general, I do think that the villain was a little bit weak. He was a bit of a letdown, but in general, this movie is just a lot of fun. I will definitely be rewatching this movie at some point in the future, if not watching it with its sequel. Okay, we have reached the top 5. Let's talk about Blue Beetle. This movie is, again, a lot of fun with a lot of heart, with a great family dynamic that works extremely well in this movie. Honestly, even more so than Shazam, because I think this movie has a darker edge to it that makes it just that much more impactful, especially when it comes to the storyline with the main character in this film and his father. This is a movie that I've only seen once in theaters, and the audience that I watched it with was going nuts for some of the cultural, references and jokes in this film that just made the whole theatrical experience so entertaining for me. But in general, I think the comedy really works in this movie. I think the casting really works in this movie. George Lopez is hilarious in this movie. I think he was such great comedic relief as the uncle in this film, and Xolo Maridueña, again, phenomenal as the lead character in this film as Blue Beetle. I think his chemistry with the love interest was great. His chemistry with his entire family was great. And the emotion that Xolo brought to this role, especially when it came to him and his father, absolutely tore me to shreds. I loved these characters being on screen. And yes, this movie does have a villain problem. It feels very much like an early MCU movie where the villain is just like a beefed up version of our hero. But you know what? It's fine enough. And I think that it had the stakes because of the father storyline in here. So I think it worked just enough for me to definitely want to rewatch this before the DCU if it does decide to connect in the way that James Gunn is teasing that it will, even if it's just a casting moving over or if it is actually canon in the DCU with this movie, even though they said that this is the first character, not the first movie in the DCEU. So I don't know how that's going to work canon-wise, but either way, this movie is extremely entertaining. That's honestly, I've only seen once, and I don't know why I haven't gone back to revisit it yet. All right, we have reached it. We have reached Zack Snyder's Justice League in this ranking list at number 4. Now, this movie is a movie that I really do enjoy in moderation. I think the 4-hour runtime is going to be the elephant in the room for this film, but when I rewatched it, I actually watched something called the Zack Snyder Cuts Condensed Edition. It was a fan edit of the director's cuts of this movie that cut it down to 2 hours and 50 minutes, and honestly, that's probably the perfect runtime for this movie. I think if we were in a different timeline and, Snyder wasn't taken off of this movie and replaced by Joss Whedon, it was released in its original vision, obviously it wouldn't have been 4 hours long. The studio would have had to make cuts from this movie, and I think this condensed version, which if you look it up on Google or on YouTube, you can find a link to it and watch it there. But I think this condensed version picked the right things to cut out, all the weird moments in it, the weird singing from the people in the Aquaman random weird fishing town. It cut out the weird hot dog moment in the Flash sequence, but it still has that Flash sequence in it, and it cuts out a couple other just awkward moments. It cuts down some of the slow-mo in this film as well, and just kind of hones in on a version of this film that feels theatrical, and I love that. I love that for this film. In terms of rewatching the full 4-hour cuts, honestly, I don't think I'm going to rewatch that, but if this movie was in a shorter, more condensed package, I honestly love a lot of things in this film. First of all, I think the biggest surprise about this movie for me was the humor in it, because I was expecting this movie to be as dark and as moody and as dreary and bleak as, Man of Steel and particularly Batman vs. Superman from Zack Snyder, but no, there's a lot of hope in this movie, and it shows our heroes being fairly heroic. It's not necessarily them directly actually saving people like I was kind of wanting for, but they at least had a positive outlook, which again, I think that does a lot for characters in this film. Just having that positivity, having that outlook, having that hope, even though things are getting pretty dark in this movie with Darkseid looming over all these characters and having Steppenwolf be the foot soldier doing all these things on Earth. I do think that storyline does work extremely well as compared to the theatrical version. But there are really two things in this film that stand out above everything else in this movie, which is Ray Fisher as Cyborg and the Flash moment at the ending of this film. And let's talk about Cyborg first, because I think that Ray Fisher is really good in this movie. I think with his own solo film, he could have grown a little bit more with this character. I think that it has some similar issues that I had with Henry Cavill in Man of Steel, with some of his performance feeling a little bit stilted, but he's also a cyborg, so I think maybe some of it is intentional. But I really like his arc in this film and his growth in this film and what happens to his father by the ending of this film. He really is the heart and the soul of this movie that just brings it up to a different level, and it's baffling that they cut him in the way that he did. And talking about the DCEU and the executives at Warner Brothers doing actors dirty, this is probably even worse than the situation with Henry Cavill, what happened to Ray Fisher on set and the problems that he had with Joss Whedon and how the executives handled it and just kind of shoved him out of the movie and cut him entirely, and just it is absolutely frustrating to see how butchered this movie was, especially when it comes to Cyborg's involvement. And then you have the moments with the Flash at the ending of this film, which how in the world, as an executive at Warner Brothers or of somebody who is a fan of DC Comics, how in the world do you cut out the Flash going back in time? Even if just for a split second to save our heroes from losing at the hands of Darkseid and Steppenwolf, how in the world can you cut that out of this movie? It is absolutely a baffling decision that this movie makes, or that the theatrical movie made. That is absolutely insane, because it is easily one of the best moments in the DCU in general. Honestly, maybe my favorite moments in the DCEU. I will say that I still do have problems with this theatrical cut of Justice League. I do think that's, the Batman stuff. The Batman stuff really does bother me, because again, this is more so problems with Batman versus Superman than anything else, because that character was so much against Superman, and he was so, hardened and dark as a character, and he was so much in the gutter in terms of where he was in his life, and all of a sudden he's like, no, we need to save Superman. Yeah, he's a symbol of hope. We never got to see, again, Superman be a symbol of hope, because he never saved anybody. He was never a hero in the eyes of me as an audience member or the people in this world itself. And this movie hinges upon the idea that Superman was a symbol of hope, but we never really got to see that in those previous two movies. And so Again, my problems with this movie is still the foundation of Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, but I do think this is easily the best of the Snyder trilogy, and it was kind of pointing the series in a direction that was like a kind of a mix between the lightheartedness of Wonder Woman and the darkness of what Snyder set up in this movie or in his earlier movies, and it kind of had a nice balance of humor, a nice balance of those dark moments, a nice balance of his style and tone that he established for this DCEU, and it did tee off for an exciting look at what's, the second one was going to be, what part two was going to be with Darkseid, and we're never going to get that, and it's really sad to see that we're never going to get that, but in the end, I do think that this is a good movie that is, kind of shocking that it exists, that we can actually watch this movie, because Warner Brothers really should not have released it in the way that they did, but they did release it. I own it on 4K. Again, I probably won't watch the full 4 hours again, but if I am watching that condensed version, I wouldn't mind watching that again anytime soon.
This is our story. And I'm telling it, so I'll start where I fucking want.
All right, so we've reached the top 3 with Harley Quinn and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Yes, I still stick with that original title because I love that original title. And this is another one that I unapologetically absolutely love. And this was a moment at the DCEU where I feel like they were kind of skimming through all the things that worked in the DCEU. Like, okay, Wonder Woman worked. People really liked Harley Quinn. Okay, let's go with those sort of things at this point in the DCEU. Shazam worked. We're going to do things that are more lighthearted, and we're going to stick with this style for movies at the time being. And I loved it. This is one of those movies that just really does work for me on a lot of levels because of the manic way this movie's edited, how it's, fully put in the perspective of Harley Quinn, who is very much an unreliable narrator, and how this movie is, told in terms of how it's out of order, in terms of how things happen in this movie, how over the top it can be at moments, while also being pretty grounded and having a really fun team dynamic in this film. I do really like this movie's story, and I think that's, Ewan McGregor as the villain of this movie is so, again, over the top and hammy and just having the most fun he's ever had on screen as the villain of this film. And Margot Robbie really just is perfect as Harley Quinn. I honestly can't think of a better actress to play this role than Margot Robbie, and you can definitely tell the difference between, her performance, or not really her performance, but her writing in Suicide Squad versus her writing in this film, and it is so much stronger in this film. I do think that this character needed to be emancipated in order to really find herself as a character, which is what she did in the comics. Once you separate herself from the Joker, she can really fall into her own thing. And I think this is what this movie does extremely well as being a standalone Harley Quinn movie, essentially, while also having some great moments with Mary Elizabeth Winstead as the Huntress, or, any other number of characters like Canary, or any other people that show up in this film that just have a small little role that can kind of build out this team dynamic that is really fun to watch on screen. And I think, again, I guess you're kind of seeing a pattern in kind of my rankings of all these movies, is if I have fun with a movie, it's going to be a little bit higher up on the list than when I just am kind of feeling bad about life watching one of these other movies that just kind of are a little bit too dark to kind of give hope for a comic book movie. Like, you can have dark comic book movies. I love, the darker ones, but at the same time, a little bit of joy goes a long way, and this movie is extremely funny, extremely entertaining, and just very well put together. When it comes to the negatives about this movie, I will say that this movie, you can tell its reshoots with the action sequences. Even though I do like the action sequences and how it does fit stylistically and tonally with the movie, I do feel like you can tell that it is choreographed. It doesn't feel as natural as something like Harley Quinn's fight scene in the Suicide Squad. That is such a great fight in that film, so colorful, so vibrant, and so exciting to see. And this movie tries to do also fight scenes like that. The one in the prison with the sprinklers going down is a great example of one that I really did like. But I think in the third act, with all the goons inside of the little playhouse, it feels a lot like the stunt performers are really throwing themselves at these punches, and sometimes it can feel a little bit goofy at the end of it, but at the same time, it does fit with the tone of this movie, and so I don't mind it all that much. And so this is, again, one of those movies that I just have a lot of fun with. I do enjoy rewatching pretty often, kind of in a similar way to Aquaman, where if this movie's on TV, I'll put it on in a heartbeat and I'll have fun watching it at any point. Okay, my second favorite film in the DCEU is Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman. I loved this movie, especially on rewatch. I've always loved this movie, but for some reason, the most recent time I've watched this movie, it really just clicked with me with why I love this movie so much. And I think it really is the fact that at this point in time, with how oversaturated we are with comic book movies, a lot of times it feels so plot heavy, and it feels so like, okay, this is what we need to do. It kind of loses sight of character. And I think what this movie does extremely well is character and the sense of empathy that Wonder Woman has in this film, the sense of heroism that she has, the fact that she is going out saving these people. She is so dedicated to being a hero, to wanting to help humanity, that it just rubs off on you. It has this effect on you that just kind of lightens everything inside of you and feels like you can also go out and be a hero in your own world. It's inspirational in that sort of way, and this is something that I desperately needed, especially after rewatching this in order. So I watched Batman vs Superman, then I watched Suicide Squad, and then I watched this. It is so refreshing when you watch it all in release order. And it's not just the fact that it is refreshing when you compare it to those films, but it genuinely is a phenomenal film. I think the score for this film is extremely underrated. I love the score that Hans Zimmer made, the theme that they made for Wonder Woman, but the music during the No Man's Land scene was original to this film, and it is extremely thrilling, and that is one of the best scenes in any comic book movie ever. I love the No Man's Land scene, and the whole fish out of water thing with Wonder Woman, going off, bouncing back and forth to Chris Pine is one of the best romances in any comic book movie, and I will say it here, Chris Pine is the best Hollywood Chris. Yes, I said it, even better than Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pratt, Chris whoever else there is. Pine is my favorite because he takes roles more seriously, I think, than the others. He's more careful with the roles that he picks. Like Dungeons and Dragons, he was phenomenal in that. I love him in the Star Trek movies. He's great in these Wonder Woman movies, and he just has this likability to him, this charm to him that is really only something that Chris Pine can evoke in a film, and I think that he is phenomenal in this film. Again, the heart that this movie has and that relationship that they have and that sacrifice that Steve Trevor makes at the ending of this film is everything that this movie needed. I will say the last 15 minutes it does slip into convention and into tropes of superhero movies, having to have a big CGI fight with a big bad guy at the very end. And honestly, I think if you cut that out and you just have that fight with that one military guy hopped up on those drugs and he's fighting, and then Gal Gadot realizes that, yes, it's not some evil bad guy Ares that's causing all these people to fight. That's just humanity. And you have to kind of sit back and reconcile with that idea that it's not somebody just pulling the strings, and you actually have to deal with this situation in a more deep and complex way. But it kind of, has that message, but then it rips the rug out from under you because it reveals that Ares is there the whole time as well. David Thewlis is fine in this movie. I do like his role in this film up until the very ending, but I just don't think he's as imposing as a threat as Ares should be. Maybe if they did a tease of Ares and just kind of sprinkled it in there and built it up for a sequel, I think that could have worked. And, with the way that this movie ends with Wonder Woman going off and disappearing for 100 years and then, going back to modern day and her standing on top of that pole, ready to go off into the world and to fight, it makes me wish so much more that the sequel to Wonder Woman was after this point in modern day instead of back in the past in the 80s, because it teetered off to be a hero once again in the modern world, and I still want to see that. If Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot get a chance to continue the Wonder Woman series, I will be there day one. I don't think that's going to happen, but as it stands, I do think that this is one of the biggest triumphs of the DCEU, and it's definitely one of the biggest tragedies, one of the biggest losses of having to reboot this universe is not getting to see what they would have done with a third film. And so I'm going to miss the Wonder Woman series as we had it here, but as it stands, this is one of my favorite comic book movies, and it's definitely one that I'm going to rewatch very often. All right, so we've made it to the very top of this list. What is my number one thing that is at the very top of my list? Well, of course, this entire ranking is just a Suicide Squad sandwich because the Suicide Squad is my favorite film in the DCEU. This really is a miracle of a movie because, in terms of the structure and storyline of this movie, it really is pretty much the same as the first Suicide Squad movie, but it's the execution and the direction and the concrete sense of tone that this movie has that the other one had a crisis in terms of deciding what it wanted to be. If it was the full theatrical cut of Suicide Squad that's, David Ayer wanted to have, maybe that could have made a difference in that film. It probably would have made a difference in that film, but this one totally decides to go with a more lighthearted, James Gunn type comedy style that, was built from the very beginning of pre-production to the very ending of post-production, and it feels like a movie. It feels like a story that is good from beginning to ending, and it works on all those levels where I think that the first one did not work, because it is, the ragtag group of characters that are thrown together from prison to go out on this suicide mission to take out this, threat, or they're not even taking on a threat. They're going there to get rid of some files, to destroy some files, to hide the U.S. involvement in this, Starro project. But then they unleash Starro on accident, and they have to take out the supernatural threats at this point in the movie. And that's pretty much the same exact thing that was set up in the first Suicide Squad movie, where you have these characters thrown together. They're on a mission to save this asset that's in the city, and they decide to go off on their own and stop the supernatural threats. It's the exact same thing, but this one works because it it feels right. And James Gunn is just great at taking characters that nobody cares about in the comics and making them the most interesting people on screen. The biggest example of that is Ratcatcher 2 in this film, and there's a line about having rats be the lowliest creatures in the universe, being able to make a difference in the end. Is like, that line literally brings me to tears in this movie. I absolutely love that line. It has so much emotion to it. It has so much build up that is drawn from the very beginning of the movie to the very ending of the movie. The dynamic between Idris Elba and Daniela Melchior in this movie, and their bond that they form throughout this entire movie, that is just extremely sweet. And then you have Harley Quinn just being the best that Harley Quinn has ever been up until this point. Again, that action sequence that she has in this film is one of my favorites. It is so good. The color, the style of it, so you kind of seeing inside Harley Quinn's head of how she sees all this violence being flowers and birds flying everywhere. It's such a beautiful sequence. And then you have all these stylistic choices that James Gunn makes in his movies, with the title cards that's in this film and the music kind of building on the radio in the background and all of a sudden taking over the scene when the action sequences start, and the moments where the Suicide Squad is walking through the rain towards the end of the movie as a team, with Milton also there in the background, which is one of the funnier jokes in the entire movie. It felt so impactful of seeing them as a team, as a unit, even more so impactful than the Justice League moments in both versions of Justice League. But I think what really pushes this movie from a great comic book movie to my favorite movie in the DCEU is the third act of this film. I think the way they build up the rivalry between Bloodsport and Peacemaker in this film is great. I think John Cena is phenomenal in this movie, and when he has his turn, when he decides that I'm going to destroy this government secrets and I can't let it get out even at the cost of all my friends that I made along the way, his turn in this movie is extremely satisfying and just really great every single time I watch it. And that duel happening with the bullets clashing into each other was a great moment, and then Starro bursting out of the building immediately after that, and the team deciding to go even against all odds. This group of like 5 people, a shark, a random girl with a baton, and Bloodsport with his guns, and Polka Dot Man going off, and a girl with a bunch of rats, and these characters are going against a giant kaiju star creature. It is absolutely insane and over the top, but it works. Again, the title card of seeing Suicide Squad versus Starro is one of my favorite moments in any comic book movie ever. I absolutely love this movie, and this movie is weird as hell and very comic booky, and I think that is why James Gunn is perfect for spearheading an entire universe, because he's not afraid to get comic booky. He's not afraid to get weird with his movies, and Superman Legacy is going to have some weird stuff in it, and he's also great at tone, which he very much captured the type of tone that he wanted for this film, but he's also great at a more serious tone when it comes to Guardians Volume 3 or some of his older films like Slither. He can do some more serious stuff as well, so I think that he is a master at crafting a movie that has a very specific tone that is constant throughout the entire thing, and I think that him taking over the DCU is a great choice, and I'm really hoping that it is all at the level that this movie is at. And why not? Let's throw Peacemaker in here. I'll throw it like right underneath Zack Snyder's Justice League at number 5, and you can shift everything down from there. But those are going to be my rankings and reviews for everything in the DCEU. It had to come to an end for hopefully brighter futures ahead with James Gunn's DCU, and so hopefully we can get that sooner than later. I'm very excited to get into all that stuff with DC, but for now, that is going to be it for the DCEU. I'm very curious to hear all your thoughts on all these films. I'm sure your rankings is going to be extremely different from mine, so let me know in the comments down below. Am I crazy for having the movies in the rankings that I have it here on my list, or am I perfectly spot on with my rankings? I'm sure you're going to have some controversial takes against mine, or maybe mine is controversial in your opinion, so let's hear them all down below. And of course, if you did enjoy this video, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I'm going to have my favorite movies of 2023 coming pretty soon here, along with a video on a bunch of the possible awards contenders that's going to happen later on, now that we're getting into the award season. So I'm going to have reviews out for like Ferrari, the Iron Claw, stuff like that I watched recently that I absolutely loved. I also have my review out for Poor Things as well here on the channel, so definitely go check that out and subscribe if you want to see all these reviews and more, and I hope to see you all in my next one.